Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this pretty beautiful Monday morning. At least the sun is peeking through the clouds. And I know here in Michigan, we had a nice weekend, which was a great reprieve from some of the more dreary weeks over the past few weeks. We are coming to you today to discuss the latest events that occurred over the past at the end of last week, really, Thursday and Friday into the weekend, on the executive order front, Governor Whitmer and the Michigan legislature. So we will do our best to explain efficiently what went on this past week, give you the information you need to understand each of these latest executive orders and let you go about the rest of your week. I have with me, this is Amy Murphy, by the way, I'm a litigator at Miller Johnson. I have with me Jim Peterson and Steve Van Stempvoort. I'll let both of Jim and Steve say a quick hello.
Yes, good morning, everyone. This is Jim Peterson, and I'm also a litigator at Miller Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. This is Steve Van Stempvoort, also a litigator. We've done this a couple times, so if you've been with us before, you kind of know how this is going to go. And I'm pleased to be back with you, and thank you for joining us.
All right, so Jim and Steve, let's jump right in. We have an agenda slide, and that will show our viewers who are watching on their iPhones or their computers what we're going to hit today. We're going to discuss the complicated set of emergency orders that came down late Thursday evening of last week that essentially renewed the emergency declaration in the state of Michigan. Then we will discuss Executive Order 2020-70, which is the most up-to-date stay home, stay safe order, and the industries that are now able to resume activities as of May 7th, which is this Thursday. And then we will talk about what we see coming down the pike as, businesses question when are we going to be able to reopen, as the legislature seems to be shifting toward a litigation mode with Governor Whitmer. So we'll go through all of that and then get you on your way for hopefully a happy and productive Monday. So let's get going with the emergency declaration business of last week. Steve, would you be willing to walk through what happened in the legislature last week and how that led to the issuance of these three executive orders, 66, 67, and 68?
Sure, happy to do so. So those of you who have been following this know that it may, it's a relatively complicated set of circumstances. But boiled down, what essentially happens is that the governor was asking for an additional 28 days to extend the emergency declaration. Now, the emergency declaration is the basis for all of the other executive orders that relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, there needs to be declared emergency in order for all the rest of these executive orders to continue to exist and have authority to exist. There are a couple statutes that give the governor of Michigan the power to declare an emergency. One statute is from 1945. The other statute is from 1976. And they aren't necessarily entirely consistent. And the biggest difference is that the 1976 statute has a requirement in it that the governor request permission to extend it if the declaration or if the emergency declaration goes beyond 28 days. The 1945 Act does not appear to have any sort of temporal limitation, at least by the language of the statute. So originally, Governor Whitmer declared emergencies under both statutes. The legislature last Thursday declined to extend any of the emergencies. So Executive Order 66 is the required declaration that the emergency under the 1976 statute no longer applies. It no longer exists. And so that's what Executive Order 66 does. It declares the state of emergency over. Now, that state of emergency is the same emergency, really. It's the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's an argument to be made that perhaps that that declaration that there's no longer an emergency also eliminates the emergency under the 1945 Act, but we can talk about that a little bit later. So Executive Order 66 is the termination of the state of disaster or state of emergency. Then Executive Order 67, and this is another one that was issued late Thursday. So 66, 67, and 68 were all issued late Thursday. Executive Order 67 says, well, even though the emergency under the 1976 statute has been terminated, the emergency under the 1945 statute remains in place. And so that's what Executive Order 67 does. It kind of restates the fact that there's still an emergency. And then Executive Order 68 is one in which Governor Whitmer said, okay, I know that I just terminated the disaster under 1976 statute. However, I'm going to reissue the same emergency declaration under the 1976 statute and extend it for another 28 days. So in sum, what we have here is we have 66 terminates, and then 67 and 68 are orders that say, no, the declaration of emergency is going to last another 28 days. That's kind of what's going on. Now, there are all sorts of legal issues surrounding that, given that the legislature is not on board with this, but we can talk about that down the pike.
Yeah, and I think setting aside the question of the validity of what Governor Whitmer did in those 3 executive orders, whether they comply with the statute and whether they can comply with constitutional principles, which we will tease about a little bit later. Essentially, Governor Whitmer is saying this emergency, from her vantage point, continues through May 28th. Is that right?
That's the upshot of it. Yes.
That's true.
Okay. So now we're up to 71 executive orders. There was, after that string, that trio of emergency declaration orders late Thursday, then Friday into the weekend, we got 69, 70, and 71. But we're going to focus on Executive Order 2020-70 because that's the latest, most current, most up-to-date stay home, stay safe order, which applies obviously to all of our listeners in Michigan, whether you're just moving about your day or trying to decide whether your business can reopen or can stay in business, or stay in operation. So Jim, could you give us an overview of what Executive Order 2020-70 did?
Sure. So in essence, it kept in place all of the same restrictions that the earlier executive orders, as amended, had in place in terms of stay home, stay safe. But then it also expanded the breadth of what was permissible to include work that's traditionally performed outdoors, such as forestry work, outdoor power equipment technicians, parking enforcement, and similar workers, and then most significantly for our clients, workers in the construction industry, including the building trades, subject to certain enhanced social distancing rules that are set forth in the order. And then also workers in the real estate industry, including agents, appraisers, brokers, inspectors, surveyors, and registers of deeds. And all of those, the relaxation is effective just after midnight on May 6th. So they go into effect at 12:01 a.m. on May 7th. And then it also includes a new category of workers necessary to the manufacture of goods that support workplace modification to forestall the spread of COVID-19.
And a quick question off of that last category, Jim, is there anything in the latest executive order telling us who fits into that category of manufacturers who support COVID-19 modifications to the workplace?
There really isn't, and so that like the earlier, relaxation that applied to resumed activities, including goods that could be delivered or made available for curbside pickup based upon remote orders, those categories are actually very broad And so, as we discussed earlier this morning, right, if a manufacturer that performs any work that is geared to modify the workplace to make it more safe from COVID-19, I think they can fall within that category.
And you mentioned, Jim, that there are these enhanced social distancing rules. So for our clients in construction or outdoor work or that slim manufacturing sector or potentially real estate workers, what sorts of social distancing measures do they need to comply with starting when they resume their activities, this week?
So the same ones that were in place earlier, prohibiting gatherings of any size in which people can't maintain 6 feet of social distance from one another, limiting in-person interaction with clients and patrons to the maximum extent possible, and then providing personal protective equipment such as gloves, goggles, face shields, and face masks as appropriate, and then adopting protocols to limit sharing of tools. Those were the ones that had been in place. The new ones in Order 70 are adhering to all of those, and then they also have to designate a site-specific supervisor to monitor and oversee the implementation of the strategies. They need to conduct daily entry screening protocols for workers and visitors entering the work site, including a questionnaire covering symptoms and exposure to people with possible COVID-19, together with, if possible, a temperature screening. And then they need to create dedicated entry points at every work site, if possible, for daily screening. And then they also have to require face shields or masks to be worn when workers cannot consistently maintain that 6 feet of separation from other workers. And so that there are a few others that I'll go through. They need to provide instructions for distribution of PPE and designate on-site locations for dirty masks. They need to encourage or require the use of work gloves as appropriate to prevent skin contact with contaminated surfaces. They need to identify choke points and high-risk areas where workers must stand near one another, such as hallways, and control access and use so that social distancing is maintained. They need to ensure that there are sufficient hand washing and hand sanitizing stations. They need to notify contractors or owners of any confirmed COVID-19 cases among workers at the work site. They need to restrict unnecessary movement between project sites. And finally, create protocols for minimizing personal contact upon delivery of materials to the work site.
So that's a pretty hefty list of what the order refers to as these enhanced social distancing measures that our construction clients in particular need to be focused on. And the daily screening strikes me as a pretty important one to focus on because it's going to require some organization on the front end, development of a questionnaire, some sort of plan for how workers or visitors, when they enter the site, are stopped to take that questionnaire and potentially, get a temperature screening. Have we seen a similar protocol for any other industries? Where are these daily screening protocols popping up in the state of Michigan?
Food selling establishments and pharmacies already have daily screening in place, and I know from speaking with other clients that they were doing these things even before the order required these steps to be taken.
Well, I was gonna jump in on that, Amy, and turn it around to you because when I look through the requirements that are specific to the construction industry, I wonder if most of those would be dealt with in a fairly comprehensive COVID-19 response plan, which is already required of any business that resumes in-person operations. So I wonder if most of these construction-specific requirements are already covered or could easily be covered in a COVID-19 response plan, except for the screening part. I mean, the screening part really seems to be the one additional step that might not be in a typical response plan. But Amy, you may have a better idea on that.
Yeah, so OSHA has this guidance preparing the workplace for COVID-19, and Michigan businesses that have been operating under these executive orders for some time now have a requirement that they need to have a written COVID-19 preparedness and response plan that is consistent with that OSHA guidance. And you're right, Steve, the OSHA guidance really, recommends that a business think about things like where are your entrances and exits of your building or your work site, identify ways to keep those areas, avoid crowding in those areas. Think about where to have hand washing or hand sanitizing stations. Focus on PPE. If it's not true PPE, face coverings, more informal or homemade face coverings that might be necessary. Consider not just your workers who are exposed potentially, but also your own your visitors, your third-party contractors. So I agree that, if you've got a COVID-19 plan that you've been putting together, you're probably hitting on a lot of those requirements already. But I also agree that the screening protocol is really a fairly burdensome requirement that, as Jim mentioned, some businesses have already started facing because the food selling establishments and the pharmacies and the grocery stores are required to be doing that as of, maybe about a week ago. There was Executive Order 60 that required that. There also are county-specific orders around the state, at least 22 counties in Michigan that require a similar daily screening protocol for all workers arriving on site to a business in those counties, regardless of the industry, right? So any business that's trying to stay in operation during the stay home, stay safe order. And some of those screening protocol orders at the county level have expired, but some of them have not, because the local health officers in each county they have some authority to enact measures like that to protect the public health in their counties. So some of this will be a heavy lift for our construction clients, and we do encourage you, if you're interested in seeing a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan and getting some assistance with tailoring that plan to meet the obligations that are in this newest executive order, reach out to us. We've got materials on that, and we'd be happy to help you. Before we move on to our predictions about what's going to happen in a couple of weeks ahead, Jim, Steve, do you have any other thoughts on Executive Order 2020-70?
So just one thing I wanted to mention is that even though the governor's renewed state of emergency is effective through May 28, Executive Order number 70 with the stay home restrictions is only in place through May 15.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the deadline for the stay home, stay safe order hasn't actually changed since the last version of the order, right? Number 59 had the same May 15th end date.
Correct.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, Amy, is that, and this will be no surprise, but, there's been this ongoing debate over whether the governor may or should adopt the updated CISA guidance. That's the Department of Homeland Security guidance explaining what counts as critical infrastructure that has been updated several times since the first version. And this executive order, like the other ones, does not adopt the updated guidance from the Department of Homeland Security, the updated CISA guidance. And so that's not a real surprise, since that's kind of been the trend over the last several executive orders, stay-at-home orders. But I just wanted to clarify that is also the case here.
That's another good point, and an important one for our clients who have interstate operations, because although we haven't done a thorough check, most states are adopting the CISA guidance as it gets amended and supplemented. So there are ways in which Michigan's order, even though it adopts CISA guidance, it's adopting a more circumscribed set of critical infrastructure categories than other states. and that can cause some confusion for our clients for sure. So let's do a little bit of predicting about the future, a little bit of looking into the crystal ball. Steve, tell us what you see coming down the pike from a litigation perspective, given what happened in the past 4 or 5 days.
Well, one of the issues is the validity of the ongoing emergency declaration. As I said before, the governor's renewed emergency declaration is the basis for orders such as this renewed stay home, stay safe order. If there's no emergency, then there's no basis for imposing these sorts of requirements on Michigan businesses. So it is a very interesting situation. It's a very complicated set of circumstances. The legislature, both houses of the legislature, which are Republican controlled, have authorized the majority leaders in those respective chambers to file litigation against the governor, challenging her ability to extend the emergency declaration under both the 1945 statute that I referred to earlier and the 1976 statute. So there, I mean, that is going to be, we expect that to be filed sometime this week, maybe midweek, and that will be really interesting to watch. It's unclear what a court will do in that scenario, but obviously that has ramifications for whether businesses will need to abide by certain of these requirements. If it turns out that the emergency declaration is invalid and that the rest of these items are invalid, then a lot of these requirements are going to fall by the wayside. Now, perhaps the legislature will step into the brink or step into the gap and pass some statutes that require similar things. But that is going to be something that is worth watching and worth seeing how it shakes out. In terms of other litigation, those sorts of issues about, the validity of the emergency declaration, the validity of the stay home, stay safe order, those are going to be, I predict that some of those issues are going to pop up in litigation down the pike, whether it's because, businesses are opening up now, even though some of the suppliers are not opening up. There's going to be a little bit of friction, I think, between certain companies that want to get going and other companies that, for whatever reason, do not or cannot resume operations. And so once you see the economy and operations starting to open up in a kind of a staggered basis, I think there's going to be friction between those lines. And I think that we will see some degree of litigation, or at least, some legal issues arising between companies that supply each other or provide services to each other and are not on the same page about what can or should be done.
Jim, what about you? What do you think we'll see in the week or weeks ahead in terms of litigation, either on the executive order front or otherwise?
Sure. So I think that there will continue to be lawsuits that are brought by private individuals and businesses against the governor and the attorney general due to either a lack of clarity and understanding about what they can do or a disagreement about the restrictions in the governor's order. And some of this is inside baseball, right? The separation of powers arguments, which are fascinating to constitutional scholars, but not necessarily that interesting to people who just want to be able to resume business operations without either the threat of law enforcement attempting to cite them criminally or shut their business down or threaten their license. And so I think that we will see, as we have over the past couple weeks, lawsuits that are brought by individuals and businesses challenging provisions in the governor's order.
And at least some of that litigation activity has had an effect in terms of putting some pressure on Governor Whitmer, right? We saw the Executive Order 59 lifted the previous executive order that had stay-at-home provisions, lifted restrictions on landscaping and nurseries. And Jim, in terms of how that came about, there was litigation on that front, right? As Governor Whitmer was considering making some sort of exemption for those industries.
Yes, clearly there was litigation, and then shortly after that litigation was filed, the governor amended the restrictions to relax them. And so I think that litigation is part of a strategy that can put pressure on the governor to change her mind and relax restrictions. But, obviously also one of the goals in litigation is to win and bring about a change that's not just temporary, but that's more permanent. And those are the more interesting legal issues to see how those will play out over time. But what do you think, Amy? You've been following this for as long as it's been going on as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the angle of litigants or potential litigants who are considering filing lawsuits challenging these provisions, it is a twofold effort. One, to sort of get temporary relief that maybe comes about because the litigation puts pressure on the governor to enact some sort of change in her orders. But there are also very weighty questions about the emergency powers that have been by statute given to the governor, and whether those delegations of authority comply with or are consistent with the separation of powers and certain other kind of academic doctrines that underlie the Michigan Constitution in the same way that they underlie the U.S. Constitution. So separation of powers, non-delegation, some of these interesting legal issues that, from the perspective of a litigator, we don't get to debate these all too often at the state level. And so it is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. And we'll see, at least, in the coming couple of days, we suspect, we'll see headlines because the Michigan legislature is going to take up these issues and head on, ask a court to rule that Governor Whitmer's actions were unlawful. And we'll see how quickly a court is able to move on that. As we mentioned, the stay-at-home order, assuming it's valid, is through May 15th. Governor Whitmer obviously sees a need for an emergency declaration lasting through May 28th. But if the legislature is right, then the declaration of emergency ended on April 30th, and today is May 4th. So we're in a very strange area in terms of being, burdened by pretty significant executive orders and having a significant public health emergency, but potentially some arguments are out there that could have legs that say, that these orders extending any of these provisions past April 30th didn't comply with the law. So it's going to be, interesting to say the least.
Right. So one thing I wanted to amplify there is I think that may cause the counties to step in, right, and take some additional steps themselves, because I know that they have been concerned about what's going to happen between the legislature and the governor and what they can do to take appropriate measures to continue addressing the public health situation, even though there is some uncertainty or things at the state level are in limbo.
I agree. 4 or 5 weeks ago, there were only 4 counties in the state that had a county level order requiring things like a daily screening program of employees for businesses that were continuing to operate. Now there are well over 20 counties with such an order in effect, and additional counties that don't require it but recommend it. So I think I agree with you, Jim, that it could be counties that fill the gap while things are in limbo, or if there's ambiguity at the state level about what Governor Whitmer's orders truly can be doing, whether they're valid or not. Hey, we do have
Well,
one question from a listener. Steve, go ahead, and then I'll pop a question to you both.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that raises the interesting question of, what happens if the counties start putting in place their own versions of requirements, screening protocols, restrictions on the types of business operations that can be implemented. And then let's assume that the state stay home, stay safe order is upheld and is valid. What happens if there's a discrepancy between the two, right? I mean, does the statewide order trump the county, the local order, or do they have to be, both complied with? I mean, there are a lot of interesting issues that arise if there is if the counties do start issuing multiple executive or their versions of executive orders, and to the extent that they're not congruent or not perfectly congruent with the statewide requirements, there's some interesting issues over what you have to comply with and how you have to comply with them.
Oh, completely. And I think these issues have been rarely addressed, right? Steve and I looked at the question of what could counties be doing when the state's got an order in effect, an emergency order. And the questions that arise, they come up from the Detroit race riot era of the late 60s. That's really the last time some of these questions have been addressed. What can a county do, when the state arguably has the power to take sort of the most stringent measures in emergencies? Can counties do something different? Can they add on? Can they conflict with the state order? And those kinds of questions will be ones that we try our best to work out for clients who are having to comply with a state order and a county order. Which governs, and is there any preemption? Those questions will be ones we see coming down the pike as well. Jim and Steve, we have a question from a listener who's asking, basically, have we heard anything from law enforcement about businesses who are starting to open now, even without the quote unquote go ahead from the state?
So
have either of you heard anything?
Sure. So I've continued to talk with law enforcement at the police level and then also at the prosecution level. And they've continued to say that their emphasis is going to be on education and getting compliance rather than on issuing citations. I spoke with one client over the weekend who plans to resume operations despite the lack of clarity in the order and what's permitted with respect to its specific operations. And that client, I believe, was going to contact the local unit of government and just explain what they were doing, kind of as a preemptive step, but also a courtesy, just to say, look, this is our plan, and we wanted to let you know so you don't think we're doing something behind your back or in secret. What about you, Steve?
No, that's similar. I think that the businesses that I have seen reopen, I think there's more willingness to take an aggressive interpretation in terms of what is permitted under the executive order. That's just kind of the general trend that I've seen. And I have not seen a significant uptick in law enforcement activity. If anything, it seems to be reduced from what it was, in the immediate aftermath of the executive order way back in March. Early on, there's quite a bit of activity in terms of, folks calling in complaints to various hotlines and law enforcement officers showing up and asking to see what was going on and justification for particular businesses being open. I've seen a slowdown in that sort of activity, even as more and more businesses start to ramp up. And so we'll see how that continues. Obviously, to the extent that the facts on the ground about the pandemic, about open and active cases in the state of Michigan, as those statistics change, that may have an impact on this either way. But currently, I don't see a huge emphasis from law enforcement about trying to enforce the order very strictly. I continue to see a fairly light touch.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One thing you could probably say about all of this is that the more complicated and more development happens in the executive orders, we're on our, 21, 42, 59, 7. So fourth executive order, that's a stay home, stay safe order. The harder it becomes from an enforcement perspective, I think, because, the first order was much more clear for your neighbor next door or the business next door to see maybe you were operating in a way that they thought was not in compliance. Now there are so many exceptions, and there's guidance on the state website, and some of that guidance conflicts with the order at times. And so there's a lot of confusion caused by the more complicated these orders get. And that makes it difficult from an enforcement perspective, I think, for police on the ground to really have a sense for what is within bounds and what's not. And for, obviously that's another reason why this is all very tricky for our clients, because they are having to comply with a bit of a moving target. And we appreciate that is a difficult situation for you. So hopefully, if you are thinking about resuming your activities this week in light of the new order, and if you have any questions, we'd be happy to run through those questions with you and give guidance where we can.
Absolutely.
All right, and on our agenda, the last couple of items we'll tick through in about a minute here. I think we anticipate that, we'll see more executive orders. I don't think any of us doubt that right now, given that we're at number 71 right now, and all but 4 of those executive orders are orders in 2020 that respond to COVID-19. So Governor Whitmer doesn't seem to be slowing down. And in some of those future executive orders, we're likely to see relaxations that affect, more and more businesses. So Governor Whitmer is taking what she calls the dial approach, dialing up, dialing back. So she's right now in the process of reopening in a fairly incremental way, reopening businesses in the state, and we'll expect that the next stay-at-home, stay-safe order could include exceptions for other industries. That all assumes that, the number of cases and the number of deaths continue to flatten, or even in some cases start to, really slow, because she has at least indicated that, assuming, or if the situation on the ground changes in terms of number of cases, number of people getting sick and severely ill with COVID-19, that we might have to revert to, some earlier position with fewer businesses operating. But of course, our hope is that the trajectory for our state is more reopenings. And we also think there could be enhanced sanitation protocols that businesses on a wider level, across industries may have to comply with. I think the OSHA guidance in this COVID-19 plan is probably a requirement that's going to extend for some time. I don't see that changing at all. Jim and Steve, any final thoughts on what businesses could expect to see in future executive orders?
Well, the hope, certainly, as you've observed, is that there's further relaxation based upon the information that is being presented to the governor and to the legislature, that the curve continues to flatten, and we see the number of cases decrease as we see increased testing capability and the other things that we know that the medical and healthcare profession is working hard at, as well as manufacturers to make the equipment necessary to support that. And you know, we'll see this not only in Michigan, but really throughout the country and in other countries. Amy, you observed that we're looking at states as laboratories now as they relax the restrictions, and we'll see what happens over the next few weeks about you know, what appears to be working and what doesn't appear to be working.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, number one, this is not the last version of the stay home, stay safe order that we've seen. This one only lasts through May 15, and I would be very surprised if we don't get some sort of update, whether that dials it back or dials it up. We'll see, but I'd be very surprised if we don't have another order in place in the next week or so. And then secondly, I think, you know, COVID-19 obviously is a public health problem. I mean, people are getting sick. I think in response to that, I think there are going to be, I think businesses who operate, especially those who interact with public, are going to have to think carefully about how to sanitize, right? How to make sure that their workplaces are clean. Hopefully, you know, you referenced the laboratories of democracy concept about, you know, the different states, all of which are opening kind of in different ways, slightly different industries are permitted to remain open or resume operations in these different states. Hopefully we'll be able to figure out what's working and what doesn't work. I think there will be an increased emphasis on maintaining safe workplaces as opposed to essential workplaces. And to the extent that those practices can be identified that make a workplace safe, both for the public and for employees, I think that those practices, whether they're sanitation or improved workflow processes or whatever it is that keeps workers and the public relatively safe from COVID-19 transmission, I think those practices are going to stick with us, and I think they're going to be required at some point. I think every employer is going to have to figure out, or every employer is going to have to expect that they will have to comply with increased requirements to maintain a safe and sanitary workplace. I think that's just a reality.
I agree. Well, I think we've ticked through everything on our agenda, and we see no further questions. If you have any questions, you should feel free to contact any of the three of us. We are continuing to monitor each of these stay-at-home orders and the other executive orders that are affecting your business. We thank you for being a part of our webinar today, and we hope you have a safe and productive week ahead.
Yes, thanks everyone for listening in this morning.
Thank you all.